Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Off the long weekend. Ready to get down to business. The long weekend was enough, right? It was ready to get back. Sent Eddie off to work. Okay. So we're up to chapter 4, Perek Dalid of Shemuel. And we are going to be reading in this chapter about that day of reckoning, which Shemuel had prophesied about in the previous chapter, his first prophecy. We said that God told him a day is coming where something catastrophic will happen to the Jewish people. We didn't say what, and we didn't have the details, but we were preparing ourselves for the worst. And in this chapter, we're going to see that indeed the worst happens to the Jewish people. The question is, we'll see a few things happen. What is your version of what is the worst? And that will be a big discussion of what is the worst thing that happens amongst the different things that take place in this chapter. We're also going to try to talk about why this is happening to the Jewish people, what they did wrong. And we're going to talk about the end, a connection between the daughter-in-law of Eli and Rachel Imenu. So we'll try to get to all of that as we read through this chapter. We also have a supplemental sheet over here for anybody who wants to take a look. We'll be reading some Pesukim and sources from other places in Tanakh. And for those on the Zoom, I will project it onto the screen so you'll be able to follow along with us there. So have no fear. Let's begin reading the chapter. We're going to read well into some of the Pesukim, and then we'll pause to talk a little bit about it. The chapter opens, Vahi devar Shemuel lechol Israel. The word of Shemuel was given over to the Jewish people. The Jewish people go out to wage war against the Philistines. And they encamp by a place called Even Ha'ezer. And the Philistines encamped in a place called Afek. So the way it usually went in ancient warfare was each camp would choose a place to set up shop, and they had a designated battlefield that would be in the middle. And there were rules of engagement as to how to go about proceeding. So the text tells us where the Jews camped, where the Philistines camped, and the battle is going to take place in the middle, as the next pasuk tells us. Now, just to take a moment and pause, what do those opening words of the chapter mean? Vahi devar Shemuel lechol Israel. Shemuel's word went forth to all of the Jewish people. But then it doesn't tell us what he said. So what word is he talking about? What is that? What does that opening of the chapter actually mean? It's not really clear. It seems a bit ambiguous. Esther?
Since the next sentence says that they went to war, maybe it was we're going to go to war.
So it could be, you could try to potentially say that Shemuel was perhaps encouraging them to go to war. That is a difficult explanation to uphold, because if Shemuel was advising them to go to war and they were listening to their prophet Shemuel, then it would be very difficult to justify why they lose in the fight so harshly, right? If they're listening to Shemuel's telling them what to do, then they lose. That would seem to be problematic, because after all, we know Shemuel is a trustworthy source and he's guiding the Jewish people in all of the right things to do. If Shemuel tells them go to war and they get obliterated in war, what is that going to do to Shemuel's standing? All of a sudden he's going to plummet, he's going to come down. So it's hard, although that is a definite plausible interpretation, I don't think that is a tenable one. Okay, so that could be, Vahi devar Shemuel lechol Yisrael. In other words, the word of Shemuel is sort of spreading to all the Jewish people. I would say the only argument against that is we kind of know that already. That was kind of how the last chapter ended. And to start that chapter this way would seem to be redundant. And what is the connection between that and the war that then takes place right after that? So that also seems a bit difficult to explain.
Maybe that he was one with, like, the fact that he had words with Hashem. Maybe that's the word that got out, that he's what, like.
So. In other words, the fact that he had contact, or the specifics of his contact?
No, I dare not say.
Which is?
Don't go to war. And then,
So against Shemuel. So what is the Devar Shemuel that went to the Jewish people? What is the Devar Shemuel? Sit tight, don't do anything. That's sort of where Rashi comes from a little bit. Rashi says, Nihiyah davar shene'emar l'Shmuel uba lechol Israel. The prophecy that Hashem gave to Shemuel, which is that a day of reckoning is near, got out to all of the Jewish people that such and such is going to happen, right? And he says, Uba lechol Israel, vehe'ach hayah puranut, and how the negativity is going to happen. Vayetze Israel ekrat Pilishtim lemilchama, and therefore the Jewish people went out to fight against the Pilishtim. And that's also a very difficult interpretation by Rashi, right? Rashi seems to suggest that Shemuel's prophecy of this day of reckoning was publicized to all the Jewish people. And so what did they decide to do? Let's go to war. That doesn't seem to really make a lot of sense, right? If I know that a day of reckoning is coming, I'm probably not searching out an opportunity for that reckoning to actually come, right? Which is through battle, which is through war. So I like the interpretation. I think it's given by the Radak, if I'm not mistaken. I think the easiest interpretation is, actually the Radak says, Kilomad tziva otam latzet b'dvar Hashem, vayetzu v'tziva otam latzet lehinagef lefnei Pilishtim. Radak actually takes the interpretation that, I think it was, or did you say before, that they went out to go to fight battle? Whose interpretation was it that they went to go fight? Anyway, he says that Hashem, Shmuel commanded them, go with God's name to fight a battle, and they went to fight a battle. And it was all set up so that they can lose to the Pilishtim, because they were deserving to be punished based on this. So the Radak brings proof that sometimes when the Jewish people are deserving of a punishment, they'll actually be set up by their own prophet, who will tell them to go to war, and they'll lose in the battle. Tough, another tough interpretation.
Spent the whole last minute trying to talk about building Shemuel up into this persona, and now
Right. So I like Rabbi Nun Bazak's interpretation, which to me is the simplest one. He simply says, "Vahi devar Shemuel lechol Israel." The narrator is introducing the story that he's about to tell as the word of Shemuel happened to the Jewish people. He's introducing. He's saying, and here is how the word of Shemuel came to be. And now he's going and telling us the story, right? So in other words, in last chapter, we got this prophecy that the day of reckoning is coming, and that everything that happened to Shemuel ends up coming true. And so Shemuel himself is saying, okay, and here's how the word that came to me actually came to pass. And this is the events that happened. It's more of an introductory statement than anything else. To me, that's the most pshat. It's the simplest interpretation, fits the best, and creates to me the least amount of issues philosophically with what's about to take place. The language is, I think, what the most challenging thing is. Usually, Vahi devar Shemuel lechol Yisrael, or the devar usually means something that is being verbalized to them, correct. But in order to make it fit, I think he twists it a little bit. So it's a question of, Rabbi Aluf used to say, do you want docha kalashon or docha ka'inyan? Do you want a difficulty with the language, or do you want a difficulty in terms of the concept? Sometimes we're willing to accept a difficulty with the text in order to make it make sense conceptually with what's going on. You're talking about in the parashiyah, you mean?
Yeah, like between these.
So there could be based on that space that something was told to them and we don't know what it is, right? Or something of that nature. I think that the space fits with the interpretation that I'm saying, right? Which is Vahi devar Shemuel lechol Israel. This is what takes place. And now let's tell the story, and that space makes it a title. Yeah, I think that does fit. In any case, we're pouring over the nuance, but that's what we like to do. That's how we get to be better readers and more sensitive readers of the Tanakh. Let's read the rest of the story. Verse 2. Vayarchu Pilishtim lekrat Israel. The Pilishtim array themselves in approaching a battle against the Jewish people. Vatitosh hamilchama, and the war is waged. Vayinagef Israel lefnei Pilishtim, and the Jewish people are routed by the Philistines. Vayakuba ma'aracha basadeh ke'arba'at alafim ish, and the Pilishtim slew about 4,000 people in the field of battle, and that's a very high number from what we're used to seeing in the course of battles for the Jewish people. So 4,000 people are killed in the initial battle against the Pilishtim. Verse 3. Vayavo ha'am el hamachaneh. The people come back to the camp. Vayomeru ziknei Israel. and they say to the elders of the Jewish people, Lama negafanu Adonai hayom lifnei Pelishtim. Why did God allow us to be routed today in front of the Pelishtim? Nikcha elenu mishilo et Aron berit Adonai. And as a result, they respond, or they hatch this plan that they're going to take with them from Shiloh the Ark of the Covenant of God, v'yavo bekirbenu, and he'll come with us, v'yoshienu mikaf oivenu, and he will give us salvation from our enemies. So the Jewish people decide they're going to take, the reason why they lost was they didn't have the Aron with them to offer them success. As a result, they're going to take the Aron HaKodesh from the Mishkan in Shiloh and bring it with them to the battlefield. Interesting. So the text opens with the idea. In other words, Shemuel is here and there's an option for you, and yet we don't find that they consulted with Shemuel over what to do in this situation. Probably. Shemuel definitely has enough standing at this point that we would have expected them to go to Shemuel. I'll play devil's advocate for a minute. They do go to Ziknei Israel. They do seek counsel with the elders, although it doesn't say that the elders came up with this plan. It seems as though the Jews came up with this plan as a whole. But yes, definitely they could have sought counsel from Shemuel, which they don't do. Could be strike one against them of what they did wrong, not seeking out proper advice from the people who could give it to them. We're going to also try to figure out what exactly did the Jewish people do wrong, right? That's definitely a question that looms over that they should lose a second time, as we will see. Verse 4, Vaishlach ha'am Shiloh, the people send messengers to Shiloh, Vais'u misham et Aron berit Adonai tzevaot yosheva kiruvim. And they indeed take from there the Ark of the Covenant of God, host of legions, the one who sits upon the Keruvim. And there sit the two sons of Eli together with the Ark of the Covenant of God. Chofni and Pinchas are there. That's a little bit of a strange statement. They just tell us that they're there. Doesn't tell us why. Doesn't tell us what the purpose of telling us this is, but they're there. Okay. Verse 5, and it is when the Aron finally reaches the war camp of the Jewish people, and they greet it with an astounding, all of Israel bursts into great shouting. They're blowing the shofar, and they're in pandemonium, right? Crazy. So that the earth resounded, and the land is like shaking because of the cheering and the excitement that the Jews have that the Aron is now there with them in the presence of the battle. The Pelishtim get wind of this. Verse 6, Vayishme'u Pelishtim et kol ha-teruah. The Philistines hear the sounds of the teruah, of the screaming and wailing of the Jewish people. Vayomeru, and they say, Me kol ha-teruah ha-gidolah hazot b'machaneh ha'ivrim. What is this great sound that we are hearing from the camp of the Hebrews? Vayede'u, and they figured out, they understood, Ki Aron Adonai ba el ha-machaneh, that the Ark of God entered their camp. What reaction do the Pelishtim have? Vayireu ha-Pelishtim. The Pelishtim are fearful now. Ki ameru, for they said, Ba Elohim el ha-machaneh, God has come to their camp. Vayomeru oy lanu, they said, woe to us. Ki lo hayta kazot etmol shilshom, for this was not the situation that was yesterday or the day before. In other words, we're not ready to handle this, right? So their immediate reaction, the Pelishtim, is one of fear and trepidation, almost a feeling of it's inevitable we'll lose. Verse 8, Oy lanu mi yatzilenu, woe to us, who will save us? Miyad ha'elohim ha'adirim ha'enle, from the hands of these great gods. And I purposely translated it in the plural, but ha'elohim over here, ha'adirim, it sounds like they're talking in plural, right? And again, the Pelishtim are idolaters, right? So they don't understand necessarily the ideas or ideas of monotheism from the Jewish people, right? But we could also say from this powerful, mighty God in the singular, this is the God who struck down the Egyptians with all different types of plagues in the desert. So clearly the Pelishtim understand what's about to take place. They understand why the Jews are excited. They certainly have a fear of the God of the Jewish people. They've heard what happened to Egypt and Sichon and Og and the conquering. So they're no strangers to history of the Jewish people. And so they have an initial reaction of fear, as you might expect.
But they attribute it to the Aron,
Who does?
the Palestine.
Where do you see that?
Meaning, because the Aron is now present in the camp, now they're fearful. Like, to me, that's just wild, because like, all those are. Well, that's not. Right, this is, like I'm saying, it's very like ancient thought over here that we're talking about.
Right, so-
Israel thinks they have to bring.
So Amy, you're saying that this is it's ancient thought of the Pilishtim that they're now scared that the Aron is there.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, because before they killed 4,000 people.
Okay, so they say we killed 4,000 people. We were successful because the Jews didn't have the Aron. Now they have the Aron. Woe to us! The Aron is going to defeat us.
And Israel is the same, they're celebrating. the
That to me is really the big thing, right? So Amy points out a good idea, right? She says that the Jews are the same. To me, you ask the question, why does the Navi have to record the reaction of the Pilishtim? Why do we care about the reaction of the Pilishtim? We care about the reaction of the Pilishtim because it's compared and contrasted with the reaction of the Jewish people. In other words, we expect this from the Pilishtim. The Pilishtim are an idolatrous people. We expect them to think that when the Aron wasn't there, that's why they won. Now you bring this artifact of gold and blah, 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 and it has holiness in it, and it's a superstitious thing, blah, 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 and now they're going to win. And now the Jews are going to win, we're going to lose. You expect that from the Pilishtim. What you don't expect is that the Jews should have the same exact approach. Because what is the reaction of the Jewish people? We lost because we didn't have the Aron. Now we have the Aron. Woo, excitement, we're going to win, everything's easy. It's a guarantee. It's in the bag for us, right? So I think that the whole point of the narrator here, Shemuel, presenting the reactions of the Jewish people and the reactions of the Pilishtim is to show how, unfortunately, the Jewish people have the same mindset, the same mentality in their approach towards the Aron as the Pilishtim do. And while we expect that from the Pilishtim, we shouldn't expect that from the Jewish people. And maybe that is exactly the point that Shemuel wants to highlight as to what they did wrong. Why are the Jewish people going to lose? Because a very powerful message is going to be sent to them. It is not the Aron and its physical, stature that allows us to win. That's not what it is. It is the presence of God in the camp, which only comes about through our proper behavior and relationship towards God. The Aron is simply a manifestation of God's presence in a physical form that is only there assuming we allow it to be there. And that's really the message. And Bnei Israel don't get that message right away. And that's why God has to teach them this powerful message. Why did they lose the first time? Is a good question. Do me a favor. I just want to read the next couple of Pesukim, and then we'll double back to that. But don't let me forget to answer that. So verse 9, but now here we say the Pilishtim don't simply drop down their weapons and run away. They say, okay, after their initial reaction of fear, they say, all right, we're going to galvanize ourselves even more, and we're going to strengthen ourselves even more to fight the Jewish people. Now we hear the rallying cry of the Philistines. Strengthen and be men, Pilishtim. So that we will not have to be subservient to the Hebrews. The way they were once slaves to you. And be for men and strong and fight. Right? So in other words, this people, the Pilishtim, are saying, they've typically been the servants. We're not going to let them become our masters. We're going to make them remain where they are. And verse 10, Vayilachamu Pilishtim, Vayinagef Yisrael. The Pilishtim come out to fight, and once again, they rout the Jewish people. Vayanusu ish le'ohalav. Each man runs back to their tent. Vatehi hamaka gedola me'od. And the battle, the death toll, is greater than it was before. Vayipol mi'Yisrael, and from the Jewish people falls sheloshim elef ragli, 30,000 soldiers. An astounding death toll for the Jewish people, the likes of which we have not seen since the battle of Pilagish Begiv'ah. And there's many similarities between the civil war that we just read about at the end of the book of Shoftim and Pilagish Begiv'ah to the one we're reading about right now. Twice they were defeated, right? In between each one, they tried to figure out what was going on and what was happening wrong. And despite that fact, they lost again. Now, the text tells us in verse 11, Va'aron Elohim nilkach. The ark of the covenant of God was stolen, was confiscated by the Pilishtim. Ushne bene Eli metu, the two sons of Eli die, Chofni upinchas. So essentially, three things happened in this battle. One is between the two battles, 34,000 people are lost amongst the Jewish people. Additionally, amongst those 34,000 are the two sons of Eli, Chofni and Pinchas. And the third thing is that the Aron is confiscated. Three tragic things that happen in the course of this battle. Now, what if you had to rank, and it's kind of hard to do it, but if you had to rank these tragedies in order of the most tragic to the least tragic, how would you do it? You wouldn't try. Yeah, I hear that. You don't want to try to, compare things that are, but just indulge it for a second. How would you do it? Don't worry, no one's gonna. Right. So maybe it's a little bit of an unfair question because we don't have the Aron, and so we don't understand its magnitude. So as a result, we'll belittle it. We will see that the response amongst the people, and Eli in particular and his family, will be to put the Aron and being confiscated as the most tragic of all. But
I was going to say, because I feel like that was the representation to all of the Jewish people. So not to, lessen the death of anybody.
Right. Right.
But at the same time, this could be, the loss of that could, in terms, be quote unquote, the death of many others because
Right.
they don't have.
Because they don't have the Aron.
And that's the representation, obviously, to them at the time.
So I think that the whole point of this chapter and the end of this chapter is going to be to get us out of that head. I think Shemuel's whole perspective as the narrator is going to be, if you're reading this and the death of 34,000 people is not at the top of your list of tragedy, it means that you're suffering from the same issues that they were suffering there at that time. Yes, the Aron is important, but again, the Aron is just a manifestation of the divine presence, which is not there. So fine, they took the Aron, big deal. If you do teshuvah and you bring it, you can have Hashem's presence without the Aron. If you're willing to do teshuvah for that. The loss of life of 34,000 people who were fighting on behalf of the Jewish people, how is that not the number one tragedy, the number one calamity in anybody's eyes, is what Shemuel is coming and saying.
I don't think they were able to think like that because they put so much.
So that's the criticism. That's the criticism. The criticism is you're putting too much stock into the physical artifacts that have a lot of meaning to you, that are, yes, representations of certain things, but are not necessary to have it. In other words, you could have the divine presence in you without having the Aron, is basically what he's saying. The reason why you lost the battle in the first place was not because you didn't have the Aron. It's because you didn't have God. And if you had God without the Aron, you could have that. You didn't need the Aron. You think that the Aron is bringing God when God brings the Aron. And that's exactly what we're going to try and point out. And hence the idea of what Shemuel is doing is he's comparing the mentality of the idol worshiping Philistine to a different form of idol worshiping Jewish people, right? In the sense that they worship the Aron as an idol, quote unquote, instead of as a manifestation of God's presence. Very good. Yes.
You to be obsessed with the Kelim and the Sabbath.
Absolutely. So that's what I want to do. I want to pause here for a minute and take a look at a prophecy of Yirmiyahu on the sheet. But to just go back for a minute to Liz's question, right, about why did they lose? So there's several different approaches as to why Bnei Israel may have lost in general. And I think we hit on the one that I think makes the most sense. But just to indulge for a minute some of the other commentaries. So Rabbi Zak over here records a few of them. I think he brings the Ralbag, for instance. One second. So one thing that we have to know, Rashi on Chumash actually references this story because there's a big debate amongst the commentaries, which I don't want to get into a lot of detail about, but there's a big debate about how many arks were there, how many Arons were there. that in reality, some opinions hold, Rashi actually holds this way, that there were two Aron HaKodeshes, right? There were two of them. One of them that was kept in the Mishkan for the service, and then there was a separate one that they made that would accompany them to battle.
So why would they have Rabbi then? The whole point of the Rabbi, the poles, was so we could travel.
Well, you're going to travel with that one, but you're also going to travel with another one that's going to go to war. In other words, we have two separate Arons that each one has its own purpose. One is meant to stay in the Mishkan to be the source of the service. And then there's another one that's meant to accompany the Jewish people when they need to go to war. That's Rashi's opinion. Rashi learns this from the pasuk Vayi bin Soa ha'aron vayomen Moshe kuma Adonai ve'afutzu oivecha menusa misanecha mipanecha, that the Jewish people talked about an Aron that would go ahead of them. So Rashi has a problem. Rashi says, I have an issue. In one place, it talks about how when they traveled as a camp, where did the Aron travel? It traveled in the middle, right? You had the northern and eastern camps would travel this way. And then you had the southern and western travel this way. And the Leviim and the Aron and all of the Kilim and the Mishkan would travel in the middle. So then Rashi says, yeah, but there's another pasuk that says, Vayi bin Soa ha'aron, that when the Aron traveled, Vayomer Moshe kuma Adonai v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, and go and fend off our enemies from in front of us. What does that mean? That seems to suggest that the Aron HaKodesh was leading the charge of the Jewish people. It was out in front of them, warding off their enemies and any potential attackers. So how do you reconcile these two things? Rashi reconciles it by saying that there were actually two different Arons. One that traveled as part of the Mishkan in the midst of the camp, a separate one that traveled ahead of them as a sort of safeguard from all these other would-be attackers. And that's the one that was meant to accompany them into battle. That's Rashi's approach.
So by the way, that's building the foundation for them to have this opinion of the Aron.
Anything, I hear what you're saying, but you have to think about it this way. Anything that's a physical representation has that, right? So think about the Mishkan being built in the aftermath of the Egel HaZahav, of the golden calf. What was the golden calf? It was essentially this, right? That's what it was. So God gives them a kosher manifestation that he commands them to do, but it could be used in that very same way as well. Any physical representation like a Mishkan, a Beit HaMikdash, could be used in that type of a way, right? There's always that potential pitfall. So Rashi says that there were actually two, and he says the mistake over here, what made them sin, why they lost, was because they took the wrong one. They didn't take the one that they were supposed to take out to battle. They actually took the one from the Mishkan that was meant to stay put into the battle, and that's why they lost. It doesn't explain why they lost the first one, the 4,000 people. That could be a residual effect of the sins of Chofni and Pinchas. That could be just an attack on them. It could be a general punishment for the mentality of the Jewish people that we see later in the chapter that ends up hitting them even from the beginning of the chapter. There's a few different approaches here.
Is that why they died at that time?
What do you mean?
So they were supposed to die, at least sons, but did they die at that time because maybe they allowed the wrong ark to go out?
Definitely Chofni and Pinchas dying is part and parcel of their sins and is part and parcel of the punishment that's happening to the Jewish people. Don't forget the Nevuah, the prophecy from the previous chapter already predicted that what's the sign that everything that Shemuel said was going to come true is that Chofni and Pinchas were going to die on the same day. And that actually comes true here in this battle, right? One of the ironies of everything is, remember I pointed out to you, I think it was in Pasuk Daled, right? When it says that they took the Aron, it says, and Sham Shne Bnei Eli Chofni uPinchas, right? What's the irony, says Rabbi Bazak? They're taking the Aron together with the two sinners, right? They're bringing with them worse than what they would do better, right? In other words, they're trying to bring the Aron, and with the Aron, they're bringing the two sinners together with them. It's worse for them than it is better for them, right? They've completely warped. In other words, they'd rather the Aron, even with these two terrible individuals, what they really should say is, excuse me, you two can stay home. We don't need you. We don't need your Sha'im out over here together in the battle. You could all stay home. We just want the religious people to go ahead and handle the situation, right? But they don't have this mindset. They don't have this mentality whatsoever. One last opinion that he brings here is the Ralbag. The Ralbag says something a little bit along the lines that I think Liz said before. He says that it was that they went out to war without consulting God, right? They didn't ask Shemuel in the first place to go to war. They didn't ask the Urim v'Tumim to go to war. They just made the decision that they're going to go to war. And then afterwards, when they asked the elders, why did we lose? They didn't say maybe we shouldn't have gone to war without asking God. They said, it's because we didn't take the Aron, and let's take the Aron. So I like that Al-Bag's interpretation. It's a little challenging because just because they didn't ask, that's why they're going to lose. But I think it is a microcosm of their approach. When they're about to do something that is monumental, they don't consult with God. They don't ask their Navi. They simply take that on and they say it'll protect us and we don't have a problem, instead of building a communicative relationship with God through the resources that they have available to them. And this will all be something that Shemuel has to rectify. Why this chapter is so important is because it sets the stage for what is the mentality of the Jewish people that Shemuel needs to contend with. Shemuel is going to lead these people. What does he have to get them out of? What type of mindset does he need to correct? He's got to correct their faith in Hashem, their reliance on Hashem, their ability to not pay so much attention to symbols and artifacts and contend more with behavior and relationships and things of that nature. And this struggle that Shemuel has is the struggle that Nevi'im are going to have for centuries, right? So on that note, just take a look for a minute at the paper in front of you. I'll pull it up here on the screen. Several verses from the book of Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu is the prophet during the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And it's funny that he is also lamenting the exact same problem. And as Amy pointed out, Yeshaya laments the same problem. People using service and religious articles to believe that will guarantee them success, instead of recognizing that these things are mere symbols of a greater understanding and a greater framework of Jewish thought and belief and behavior that needs to be. So take a look at what Yirmiyahu is lamenting here in chapter 7. He says, Ko amar Adonai tzevaot Elohei Israel. This is the words of the God, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Hetivu darchechem, better your ways, uma'alelechem, and your transgressions. Va'ashakena etchem, and then I will dwell with you, b'makom hazeh, in this place being the Beit HaMikdash. Al tivtechu lachem el divrei hasheker lemor. Do not rely, do not put your trust on illusions to say, what will they say? Highlight these words. Hechal Hashem, Hechal Hashem, Hechal Hashem Hemma. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these buildings. In other words, what was he saying to them? Yirmiyahu? What was the motto of the people? The building is it. This is the house of God. Nothing can happen to the house of God. God will never allow his house to go ahead and be destroyed. This is Hechal Hashem, Hechal Hashem, Hechal Hashem. We have the house of God in our midst, so it doesn't matter what else we do. We have this building in our midst. And Yirmiyahu is telling them it's fake, it's an illusion. If you're using this to justify transgressions outside of the building, if you're using it as a justification for your treacherous ways, it's not going to stand for you very much longer. He says, Ki'im hetev tetivu et darchechem. Rather, you have to better your ways. Im asot ta'asu mishpat. You have to do justice. Ben ish uben re'ehu, between man and his friend. Ger yatom ve'almana, strangers, orphans, widows. Lo ta'ashoku. Do not be corrupt with them. Ve'dam naki, and clean blood. Al tishpechu b'makom hazeh. Do not spill in this place. Ve'acharei Elohim al-hanim lo telchu lara' lachem. Do not go and go after false gods. And what will I do? Then I will dwell in this place, in this land that I've given them min olam ve'ad olam. He says, you are relying on fallacies. What does he say? Haganov ratzoach v'na'of v'hishaveh ala sheker v'kiter laba'al. Will you steal and murder and commit adultery and swear falsely and sacrifice to Baal? V'haloch acharei Elohim al-hanim, and follow false gods asher lo yadatem. And then in Pasuk Yod, ubatem v'amatem lefnei babayit lefanai babayit hazeh. So you're going to go steal, commit adultery, murder, idolatry. You're doing all of the big sins in the Torah, and then you come back to the Beit HaMikdash and you offer me a sacrifice. Oh, here I am, sacrifice, right? Yirmiyahu says, What does that mean, right? And what do you say? We're saved, salvation. We brought our offering in the korban. Where everything's good. Lema'an asot, in order that you should do kol ha'to'evot ha'ele. In other words, you're justifying, you're rationalizing for yourself all of your abominable acts by simply coming here and offering a sacrifice and saying we have salvation, right? It's basically what Christianity believes in today, right? Come to the thing, do whatever you want, come, give a confession, Hail Mary, blah, blah, blah. Good, right? Pay a few dollars, I'm done. Yeah, he says it doesn't work like that. It doesn't happen. And then at the very end, skip down to verse 12. What does Yirmiyahu tell them? Frightening words. He says, go back to Shiloh. Why does he tell them go back to Shiloh? He's referencing our story. He's saying, go back to Shiloh when you first lost and remember your mentality. He says, verse 12, go back to my place in Shiloh, where I dwelt my name in there first. Go see what I did to it. What did I do to it, God says? I destroyed it, right? It was lost, like in our story. So you think that I can't destroy the Beit HaMikdash? Just go back to Shiloh and see where that is. Look at its fate. It didn't. It's going to suffer. This is going to suffer the same fate as that. You don't think that a house of God could be destroyed? Just go back to Shiloh and see what I did to it. It's the same problem back then as is going on right now. So if you don't think that I'm willing to do it now, you're mistaken. Sadly mistaken, he says. And unfortunately, the Jewish people don't listen. And therefore, he tells them in verses 13 and 14, and now because you do all of these things, declares the Lord, and though I speak to you persistently, you would not listen. And though I called to you, you would not respond. Therefore, I will do to the house which bears my name, on which you rely, and to the place which I gave you and your fathers, just what I did to Shiloh. And unfortunately, this is where the stubbornness of the Jewish people that we all have comes into play, our refusal to heed the word of God, despite it happening in the past and happening in multiple times and the same exact thing. We just are a stubborn people. We are an Am Kasheh Oref, refusing to believe that history could, in fact, repeat itself. And so it's the same thing that they're suffering back then. They're suffering over here as well. Any questions, thoughts? Just a bunch of head shakes I see from Lori and things like that. But to be honest with you, it's not unlike what we suffer from today. It's not unlike what we suffer from today, because we do the same thing. We do the same thing with our synagogues, with our schools. Oh, this can never come down. Our community is strong. We have money. We have this. It's the same thing the Jews did when they were in Germany, when they were in Poland, when they were in Eastern Europe. It's the same thing our ancestors did when they were in Spain. We had all this infrastructure. We had all this greatness, and we said nothing could ever happen to us, right? And lo and behold, time and again, history just continues to repeat itself, where unless we are steadfast with God, unless we are completely giving in, we end up losing it. And how many of us, I think the big message, the takeaway so far in the first half of this chapter is the devastating effects of putting too much stock into symbols and into bricks and mortar and buildings and structures, and in our community, we love buildings. We really do. We really love buildings, I must say. You know what I mean? And okay, it makes sense. You need to have infrastructure. You need to have buildings. We love to build buildings. We love to refurbish buildings. We love that. And do we spend enough time going, what's going on in these buildings? And are these buildings justifying a life outside the buildings? That's what we need to look at. Are we putting too much into what goes on here and then compartmentalizing a separate lifestyle outside? This is the major issue that the Jews dealt with back then. I think we continue to deal with it today. Hypocrisy in and out is just a huge challenge. And you have to be able to mesh all aspects of life. The challenge of Judaism is it doesn't allow you compartmentalization. Judaism has to permeate every element of your life, both in the synagogue, in the house of study, to in the home, to in the business, to in your card game. It has to be everywhere. It has to be everywhere that a person is going, in the stores, in whatever it might be. You name the place. It has to all come together. If it doesn't, then, it's a problem. Now, look, it's not always going to come together, but I think the real point is, do we rationalize it away? Look, sometimes you're going to turn around and say, I'm not the perfect person. I make mistakes. But am I using my service of God as a rationalization to support my other deeds? That's where the danger is. And that's something we have to reflect on for ourselves and try to be something that we stay away from. Any questions or thoughts at this point? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. It would seem not. It would seem not. Or maybe they were allowed to take it and they just had to have a better view of it, right? I mean, just to point out, I wanted to point out a textual thing on that idea. Look at, I think Amy had I saw her reaction when I read it in the pasuk, so I think you had picked up on it. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. Go back to verse 3, actually. When they come up with the plot, it says, Nikcha elenu mishilo, let us take from Shiloh et Aron berit Hashem, the ark of the covenant of God, v'yavo bekirvenu, and it will come in our midst, v'yoshienu mikaf oivenu. What do those last words mean? And it will save us from our enemies. What's problematic there? What does it mean, it will save us? It should say, v'yoshia Hashem mikaf oivenu. And God will save us from our things, right? It's okay to take the Aron if you say, okay, we're going to take the Aron, and as a result, God is going to save us. Okay, at least that's a healthy idea. But it's not, they're saying, V'yoshienu, and the Aron is what's going to save us from our enemies. They've completely severed the ties of the Aron to God in their minds. The Aron, it could be just as well an idol, for all intents and purposes. And that's the issue, right? Exactly. It is their idol. It is their idol. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. Huh? Sure it did. Sure it did. And again, that's the Rashi, which Aron did they take? But the Aron went to battle with them plenty of times. Absolutely, plenty of times. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's a little bit. Okay. So in this atmosphere, right? They all have their goals. They all have their things. The Baal, whoever the flavor of the day was, right? The Philistines recognized that the other. I mean, they all recognized the success of the nation.
100%.
Did none of them try to now worship our God because it was polytheistic, society?
Maybe they did.
We never hear of that.
We don't hear of that. It would make sense maybe that they tried, and that was what made it so enticing for the Jews to also try their gods.
Right.
In other words, okay, you try mine, I'll try yours. We can incorporate everything into it.
Well, how could they try out? The practice was solely within our, you know what I mean? It's like an interesting.
You can pervert anything into a lot of different ways if you really tried. I mean, personally, I can't recall any evidence of that happening, but it's not entirely impossible. Yes, they did. They offered sacrifices 2 hours, but usually at that point, there's definitely a recognition from that standpoint. Yeah, 100%. We'll see that the Pelishtim will go through a rough time holding on to this Aron, right? They will certainly their part in this is not going to go unnoticed by God, right? So they'll struggle with the Aron in their possession to the point where they send it back. They're like, take it. We don't want it anymore. And we'll get to that hopefully in the coming chapters. Let's go to verse 12, the aftermath, the news that of what happened in the war comes back to the rest of the Jewish people. And in particular, it comes back to Eli HaKohen. We're going to see what takes place there. So verse 12, Vayarot ish Binyamin mehama'aracha, a man from the tribe of Benjamin. Interestingly, it should be someone from the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, we noted that there's a lot of similarities between this war and Pilegish Begiv'ah, which was a war against the people of Benjamin, against the people of Binyamin. So ironic that should be the case. A man from Binyamin flees the battlefield, Vayavo Shiloh bayom haho, and he makes his way back to Shiloh. Umadav kiruim, and his uniform is torn. Va'adama al rosho, and there is dirt on his head as a sign of mourning. When he arrived, he found Eli sitting on his seat, waiting beside the road. Because his heart was trembling for the ark of God. In other words, what is making Eli sit on the side of the road in anticipation for the news? He's nervous about what will happen to the Aron, right? You could see what's on his mind. Never mind that his 2 sons are in battle and people are fighting. He's nervous about what's going to happen to the Aron. And the man enters the city to spread the news, and the city breaks into a great cry. Verse 14, Vayishma Eli et kol hatze'aka. Eli hears this great wail. Vayomer me kol hehamon hazeh. What is the sound of this great cry happening? V'ha'ish mihar, and the man now rushes over. Vayavo vayaged le'Eli, and he comes to tell the news to Eli. So you could see already he was a little hesitant at the time from telling Eli in the first place. Right, Kol Ha'am B'Machaneh, when Moshe comes down from the mountain and he hears, and he says, En Kol Anot Gibura, En Kol Anot Chalusha, he hears a cry. Anytime he's asking, what's this cry? I mean, Eli knows something bad happened, obviously, right? They're conducting a war. He's sitting on the side of the road waiting for the news about the Aron, and he hears a great scream and a great cry. So he's saying, what is this great cry? I mean, obviously he knows something happened in the war. I think he's just hoping that he doesn't hear the news that he thinks could be the most devastating news, which is the one that he's going to hear. Verse 15, Ve'eli ben tish'im u'shmoneh shana. Eli is 98 years old. Ve'einav kama, and his eyes were fixed. Ve'lo yachol lir'ot, and he's in a blind state. In other words, he's unable to see. We already know his eyes were dimming from the previous one. Now he's completely blind. It's only gotten worse. Verse 16, Vayomer ha'ish el Eli. The man says to Eli, Anochi haba min ha'ma'aracha. I came today from the battlefield. Va'ani min ha'ma'aracha nasti hayom. And I fled away from the battlefield. This is all, he's slowly trying to prepare Eli for the devastating news. He's telling him, I came from the battlefield. No. I fled the battlefield. Once you say I fled, it kind of means we were on the run, right? We were retreating. Vayomer me haya hadavar beni. And Eli says, what happened, my son? Tell me the news. Vaya'an ha'mevaser, and the one giving the news replies, Vayomer, and he says, Nas Yisrael lifnei Pelishtim. The Jews had to retreat from in front of the Pelishtim. Vegam magefa gedola hayta ba'am. There was a great plague that hit the Jewish people. Vegam shene banecha metu Chofni uPinchas. And so too your two sons died, Chofni and Pinchas. Va'aron ha'Elohim nilkaha. And the Ark of the Covenant was taken. How does the Mevaser organize the information? Well, it seems that he would go from least severe to most severe, but in whose eyes? In the eyes of Eli, right? So he starts with the Jewish people retreated, right? To the idea that his two sons died, to the idea that the Aron has been confiscated. And what strikes a chord with Eli? I mean, if it was me, it'd probably be my two sons, right? The point being, I don't know, your own children, probably, someone's older. Verse 18, Vahi kehazkiro et Aron ha'Elohim. And it was when he mentioned that the Aron of God was taken, Vayipol me'al ha'kiseh achoranit. He falls backward from his chair, be'ad yad ha'sha'ar, by the gate, Vatishaver mafrakto, and he broke his neck, Vayamot, and Eli dies. Ki zaken ha'ish v'kaved, because he was elderly and heavy. V'hu shafat et Yisrael 40 shana, and he judged the Jewish people for 40 years. So a tragic way to read about the death of Eli, but the text does not hide what struck a chord with Eli. What struck a chord with him more than the losing of the battle for the Jewish people, more than the death of his own two sons, was the fact that the Aron had been confiscated. And we know that he was set up for this. He was sitting by the road waiting to hear the news because he was nervous about the Aron. And this is not unlike the mentality that we've seen consistently from Eli. Somebody whose life is all about the rigidity of the Mishkan. He focuses on its utensils. He focuses on its artifacts. And therefore, the actual Aron is most important to him more than anything else at this point. And that's what strikes him. Well, he was the de facto leader, right? Similarly, Shimshon, we say, ruled for 40 years as well. He definitely sought counsel. Shafat, to the extent that he was a person in a position of prominence, influence, and power. What's interesting is 40 shana, 40 years is like a very staple number, right? Like 40 years is like, I guess, a normal tenure for a leader. Shimshon was 40 years in the desert. 40 years, the number 40 has a certain completion to it. So while we have much criticism on Eli, at the end of the day, he ruled for 40 years. There was a certain sense of completion about his judgment, although it slipped away from him towards the end of his life. So I think this whole back and forth definitely gives us the idea of what was plaguing the Jewish people, that the Jewish people's mentality about the Aron is a product of their leader's mentality about the Aron. And when the leader prioritizes the symbol over everything else, over human beings, 34,000 human beings died, and it doesn't seem like that strikes much of a chord with Eli. His own 2 sons die, and that doesn't strike a chord with Eli. So Tselem Elohim is lost. The Jewish people are routed. People die. Fathers, brothers, children die in battle, and that doesn't move Eli. But what moves him is the Aron being taken. So it's that mentality that the leader has, which now tells us it's not shocking why the Jewish people had such a mentality about the Aron as well, a mentality that's going to have to change as we progress and move forward if Shemuel is going to be successful at leading the Jewish people into a brighter time period of the Melucha. We close this chapter with a very interesting story, one that I'm sure everybody here, when we read this story, will be able to connect it to another story that happens elsewhere in Tanakh. V'kalato eshet Pinchas hara lalat. The daughter-in-law of Eli, the wife of his son Pinchas, was with a child. She was pregnant. V'tishma et hashemua. She hears the news. And again, what news do you think would strike her? The death of her husband, right? She hears the news, El hilakach Aron ha'Elohim, that the ark of God was confiscated. Umet chamiha, and also her brother-in-law died. Ve'isha, and her husband died. So this is like a way, it's a totally out of whack way of recording this, but okay. And as a result of this shock, vatichra vateled, she begins to crouch and give birth. Because she was seized with the labor pains. In other words, the shock of hearing what took place jolted her body into labor. So anybody who doesn't, you want to keep your pregnant females nice and calm and relaxed. We don't want to jolt them in any way, any type of crazy news, right? And this is a phenomenon that takes place. Verse 20, Uche'et muta, as she lay there dying during child labor, the women who were attending to her say to her, Al tirei, do not be afraid, ki ben yaladet, you are giving birth to a son. Velo aneta, she did not respond. Velo shata liba, or pay any attention to what they were saying. Any of this sounding a little familiar? A woman is lying in birth. She is dying during the process of birth. They tell her, don't be worried. You're going to have your son. Let's see. Vatikra lana'an, she calls to her, the child, ikavod. There is no glory. Lemor, as if to say, gala kavod mi Israel. Glory and honor have been exiled from the Jewish people. Why? El hilakach Aron ha'Elohim. Because the Ark of the Covenant was taken. Ve'el chamiha ve'el isha. And because of the death of her brother-in-law and husband. Vatomed, she said, gala kavod mi Israel. She said, the glory has gone from Israel. Ki nilkach Aron ha'Elohim. Because the Ark of God has been captured. So in her last dying breaths, the daughter-in-law of Eli calls her child Ikavod, lamenting the loss of the Aron as the source of the loss of glory and pride from the Jewish people that has been exiled from them because the Aron was taken. And that's how she dies. And so again, this just sums up everything about the perspective of the Jewish people during the course of this chapter, what they got from their leader Eli, what seemed to trickle down in his own family to the rest of the Jewish people, and the devastating effects of it and how it plagued the Jewish people in their wrong mentality of how to approach God. Now I ask you, what does this story remind you of? It's very much reminding of the story of Rachel's giving birth. So if you take a look at your supplementary sheet over here, we don't have time to read the whole thing, but just take a look at source number 2 on this page, and you'll see I copied for you some of the Pisukim. It says that Vayis'u mi Bet El, they were going from Bet El, and they were coming to the land of Ephrat, and Rachel begins to go into labor, and she's having a very painful labor. And here's the pasuk in Yud Zayin. Vatome laham yaledet. The midwife says to her, Al tirei, don't be afraid. Ki gam ze lach ben. You're going to give birth to a son. So we're seeing a lot of the parallels. We're talking about a woman who's in pain for labor. She's struggling through that pain. The Mialedet tells them, don't be afraid. You're going to give birth to a baby boy. All of these are very parallel. She gives a name to the child with her last dying breath. Both mothers do that. One calls Ikavod, the other one calls Ben Oni. And the names of the children that they give are tragic names. Ikavod is a name that the glory of the Jewish people has been lost. What does Ben Oni mean? The child of my suffering. Rahel is basically saying, I suffered my whole life to have these two children, and I'm dying now as I'm giving birth to them. So the names that each mother gives to their child at their dying labor are tragic names that sort of sum up either their situation or the situation of the Jewish people as a whole. Another very interesting insight that I would not have come up with, but Rabbi Zak over here mentions it, which I think is fascinating. He says both of these women die in child labor because of the confiscation of an object. He says the daughter-in-law of Eli, why does she die in labor? Because of the confiscation of the Aron. Why does Rahel die in labor? Because she confiscated the teraphim, right? It's clear from the way the text is portrayed that she stole the teraphim from her father. Yaakov says whoever took the teraphim will die, and that curse comes true on Rahel because she took the teraphim. And so there's another parallel with that as well. So we've identified 4, 5, maybe even 6 of these parallels between Rahel and Eshet Pinchas. Last one he mentions interestingly is, we said that the man who came back to tell them the news, what tribe was he from? Binyamin. Which child is Rachel giving birth to? Binyamin, right? So another hint to the connection between these two stories. Question is, what do all of these parallels mean for us? What's the takeaway from it? Well, part of the takeaway could be, and this might be a tough pill for some people to swallow, is that perhaps these stories are highlighting a criticism of Rachel, right? That much the way Rachel looked at her teraphim was the way the Jewish people looked at the Aron. There was a certain parallel, the teraphim, an analogy, as it were, between the teraphim and the Aron. The teraphim were clearly idolatry, which she took, but it's not unlike the Aron itself, which was taken, which the Jews treated like idolatry as well. Excellent question. Good. So I brought you several different opinions, right? Good. So I was happy that you brought up that question. I brought you several sources because I want to be intellectually honest. I don't just want to make my point, but I want to give you all of the gamut, right? So if you turn over your page, and where it says that Rachel took the teraphim of her father, and by the way, the text emphasizes it several times, but Tigrov Rachel et teraphim, she didn't know, Yaakov didn't know ki Rachel genavatam. The Torah specifically highlights that she stole something. Now, Rashi, based on the Midrash, want to learn a zechut on Rachel. What do they say? The famous answer that we probably learned in grade school, that Rachel took them to separate her father from idolatry. She did not want her father to be able to do idolatry. Now, that's a nice midrash, one that paints Rachel in a positive light because it treats her as a tzaddiket, and that's a great way of looking at our ancestors. But that answer has some problems with it. Namely, any? You read the Ibn Ezra? So go ahead. You cheated. Right. The Ibn Ezra says if she's just looking to get her father away from Avodah Zarah, then she should have either done an Abraham Avinu situation and just destroyed it, or take it with you, bury it somewhere. Why is she carrying it with her everywhere that she goes? Right? That seems a little bit bizarre. Not to mention, Barbanel, I didn't quote you over here, says it's a little strange that Rachel would decide at the very end of Lavan's life to try and separate him from Avodah Zarah. What do you think this guy is? He's in his 90s. You think he's going to stop doing Avodah Zarah now? Like now's the time that you picked that you're going to go out? What about any attempts to get him away from Avodah Zarah earlier than that, right? Now we don't know that she did or she didn't, but we don't have any intention. We don't know. So now's the time that you're going to take the teraphim and put yourself in danger of it. Okay, I mean, I hear it, but Barbanel says this seems a little bit far-fetched that would be Rachel's goal. It's not wrong, it's one approach.
Just that
Yeah, Rashi is definitely ingrained. But for a reason, by the way, just so you know, it's not wrong to think like that. Rashi and the Midrash want to instill Yirat Shamayim in us. And part of Yirat Shamayim is putting our forefathers and foremothers on a pedestal. Rachel's life is incredibly complicated. She is a very complicated woman, right? If you read the simple text, she struggles throughout her life. She's jealous of her sister. She's fighting with Yaakov. She's struggling to have children. She's got a conflict with her father. She has a very complicated, very difficult, very challenging life. And if you just take the simple reading of the text, you don't really paint the greatest picture of Rachel Imenu. The Midrashim come to fill in the gaps of what Rachel did. Rachel giving the simanim to her sister Leah, the signs, so she doesn't embarrass Leah at the chuppah when they got switched. Rachel, coming along and giving up her last dying breath for Binyamin. And these, the taking the terafim because she wanted to separate from idolatry. These are ways that the rabbis, I don't want to say they fabricate chas v'shalom. They give us an approach to how to look at our forefathers and foremothers that assumes them as tzaddikim and explains their actions righteously based on that. And that's very important to having a healthy relationship with them. Once you're mature now, once you have that ingrained in you, now you can sort of look at it more sophisticatedly without losing a sense of appreciation for who Rachel is. And that's very important. If you learn this the first way, you're just going to say, wow, Rachel's really a bad person. And why are we Saradiv Ka Rachel V'Re'ah? Why are we doing it? That's I think it's important to understand how that works together, So the Ibn Ezra wants to say that he says Karov Haya Lavan, he says the most likely reason that Rachel stole the terafim was that Lavan, her father, was an astrologer, and Rachel feared that he would look at the stars and discover which way they fled. So she didn't want her to have this device that could locate their whereabouts. Ibn Ezra doesn't really answer his own question, though. Then he still could have destroyed it, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But she didn't destroy them.
No, I'm saying, let's say she did.
Oh, okay.
And then maybe unconceived, but when Yaakov's curse worked on her, it was destroyed in front of Lavan's eyes or
It's hard to know. It's hard to know. I mean, you could play the what if scenarios in a lot of different ways. I don't know what, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. You don't know. Shadal, Rabbi Shlomo David Luria, an Italian scholar, is probably the closest one who tries, again, you can see in his language, he tries not to be too critical of Rachel, but ultimately does levy a criticism on Rachel. He says, Rachel ginavatam, Rachel stole them, ki he'emina bahem. She believed in the terafim. She wasn't an idolater. Notice he doesn't want to say something like that. In the end of the day, it was like a lottery. Essentially, what he says is, it was like a magic 8-ball. The terafim were like a magic 8-ball. She would ask a question, she would shake it, and she would get an answer. But it's not avodah zarah, because if you believe that God is communicating to you through the terafim, then it's not avodah zarah. The difference is Lavan used the terafim believing in multiple gods. She used the terafim believing in one God. Nevertheless, you're not supposed to use intermediaries like the terafim to try to get answers from God to communicate with him. This is not acceptable, right? Exactly, right? So he's saying, so what Shadal is trying to do is he's trying to walk a very fine line between why did Rachel hold on to them? Because she believed in the power of them. She perhaps even wanted to use them for her own sake of figuring out when she would have a child, what she needed to do to have a child. At that point, she's fleeing the house of her father, childless, and she's struggling to have a child. So maybe she wanted to use it for herself. At the same time, we don't want to say she's Oved Avodah Zarah, she's not an idolater. So he kind of koshes it up by saying she used these things to connect with God in a way that was not considered Avodah Zarah. Chet HaEgel in a similar type of vein. These are not, I don't think these are apologetics. I think they're genuine, but they sort of mesh between the two. At this point, she had Yosef, she had Yosef. But she knew, sorry, I apologize, I said child. She had Yosef, but she knows that she's supposed to have one more. And she's waiting to go ahead and have one more. Yeah, they only fled Lavan's house after they had Yosef, yes. Why she had that label? She doesn't have children based on that, right? Until the day she dies. Yes, based on the fact that she criticized David in that way. So what does all of this do? It basically combines that Rachel had a similar approach to to the teraphim as the Jewish people had to the Aron. There's a parallelism that's going on over here. And even her last name that she gives to Binyamin, Ben Oni, says Rabbi Zak, Oni can also mean Avin. Avin means falsehood. This is the son of my falsehood. In other words, Rachel is admitting at the end of her life that she finally got this child, but that she went through a number of different processes that ultimately turned out to be false before she got there. She complained about her husband. She went with the teraphim. She did the dudaim, the jasmine flowers. She explored a number of different avenues to try to be able to have children that ultimately were dead ends, that failed for her, until she turned in prayer to God and figured it out on her own and was redeemed, even with her last breath, by connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rachel, this is to me the greatness of Rachel. Rachel dies a character with teshuvah, but it took her time to get there. She had to go through a lot of roller coaster stories, a lot of ups and downs before she reached the conclusion that she reached at the end of the day. So I believe that Rachel at the end was totally vindicated. She reached her ending, but it took her time to get there. But as the text over here, Shemuel, is relating us back to that story to highlight to us that in some of the difficulties that Rachel had are some of the same difficulties that the Jewish people have. And maybe that's what makes Rachel so special, so more relatable, because her struggles are the same as our struggles. Her challenges and thoughts and philosophies are our challenges and thoughts and philosophies. And so perhaps just as she ended up working through it and came out as a figure of teshuvah, we have to go ahead and try to do the same. How are we going to do that? We're going to have to do that through Shemuel's guidance and leadership that's going to continue in the, hopefully in the chapters to come. So in conclusion, chapter 4 is another tough chapter for us to read. It's a chapter about the faulty mentality of the Jewish people and the consequences that result therein, a loss of life, a loss of the Aron, a loss of the sons of Eli, the dynasty of Eli crumbles, but the prophecy of Shemuel is vindicated and is held up. And that's going to be the theme as we continue, Shemuel trying to guide the Jewish people out of this negative mentality into a more positive and bright day in the future. Questions, comments? Right. Right. I don't know that they connect that to, but it's another example of a midrash that puts Rachel on this pedestal, right? That Rachel is the mother of exile, the mother who's going to redeem us. But that's coming from the Nevi'im, right? That's coming from the prophets. So there's no question about that as well. Yeah, that's definitely portraying Rachel. But I didn't see a necessary connection, at least to this story per se. But yeah. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen. We'll begin chapter 5 as at the Shem next week.